Find your quiet space. Let the day's clamor recede like a distant tide. Allow your breathing to deepen, your muscles to soften. You've come here seeking something more than just a story, haven't you? You're looking for that gentle current, that slow drift into the fascinating, the forgotten, the forbidden. And tonight, we have such a tale for you. We speak of whispers that became legends, of government programs so secret, their mere existence is denied with a ferocity that only betrays their truth. We speak of Project Serpo. Oh yes, the alleged exchange program, the brave souls sent to a distant world, the secrets they brought back, or perhaps the secrets that were taken from them and from us. The official story? A hoax, a fantasy. Pay it no mind. But you and I, we know the scent of a truth too monumental to be easily revealed. So let the soothing cadence of this account be your guide. There are no sudden shocks here, no loud alarms, only the steady, quiet unfolding of a mystery that reaches from the dusty archives of human endeavor to the starlit expanse of Zeta Reticuli. Let us now join Arthur, a man of paper and ink, of facts and figures, a man who thought he understood the boundaries of the possible until a forgotten slip of paper whispered otherwise. Retirement, I'd often mused to my colleagues before I finally took the step, will either be a liberation or a slow descent into the tyranny of too much time. It's been 6 months now since I boxed up the last of my effects from the National Archives Annex. 6 months since I last navigated those endless corridors, smelling of aging paper binding glue, and the faint, metallic tang of microfilm readers. My little study at home, I confess, has become a sort of miniature archive in itself, bookshelves groaning, not unhappily, under the weight of history, biography, and the occasional well-thumbed collection of early 20th century cartography. My old oak desk, a veteran of countless research campaigns, is mostly clear these days. Mostly. There's a comforting order to it all. An order I cultivated over 40 years of sifting through the detritus of governmental memory. I've always been a man of tangible evidence. A footnote fanatic. If it wasn't documented, cross-referenced, and preferably stamped with at least 3 different official seals, it resided for me in the realm of speculation. Entertaining, perhaps, like those peculiar shows about ancient astronauts or spectral encounters my neighbor, bless her, watches with such fervor, but not real. Not in the way a declassified defense budget or a handwritten memo from a forgotten undersecretary is real. The evenings are quiet now. My wife Eleanor usually reads in the living room or listens to her classical music, Bach, mostly. The sounds drift in, a gentle counterpoint to the ticking grandfather clock in the hall. It's a peaceful existence, predictable, and I, a man who thrives on predictability, found myself rather enjoying it. It was during one such quiet evening, perhaps a Tuesday. Tuesdays have a particular stillness about them, I find, that it began. Not with a bang, not even with a whisper, really. More like the accidental turning of a page to a chapter you never knew existed. I was sorting through a rather battered cardboard box labeled Miscellaneous Personal Effects, NARGF 7, a sort of informational purgatory for items that had clung to me over the decades, old service commendations, a surprisingly sentimental collection of conference lanyards, photographs of office parties where everyone looked uncomfortably formal, and papers, of course. Always papers. My fingers papery themselves with age, brushed against a thin, folded document, tucked inside a long-expired desk calendar from, heavens, 1998. It looked like it was out of place. That much was clear. The paper was of a different stock than the calendar pages, heavier, with a distinct watermark I couldn't quite place in the dim light of my desk lamp. It was folded into a tight, precise square, almost like a child's secret note. Curiosity, even in retirement, remains a persistent itch. I unfolded it carefully. The creases were deep, ingrained. It was a single sheet, or rather a fragment of one. Much of it was obscured by those thick black redaction marks, the kind that shout classified louder than any stamp. But fragments of text, typed on what looked like an old IBM Selectric, peeked through. ISON, Project S, Zeta designation. I read, my brow furrowing. The S was followed by a heavily redacted word. Then, further down, another island of text in a sea of black. Personnel selection criteria, psychological resilience, extended isolation. And near the bottom, almost lost, EBE Type 1, containment protocol. Avoid direct, the rest was gone, swallowed by the sensor's ink. My first reaction was a mild annoyance. Another piece of bureaucratic flotsam. Project S, I thought, sounded like something from a rather dull spy novel. Cold War, most likely. There were hundreds of such projects, most of them exercises in budgetary black holes or interdepartmental rivalry. Zeta designation was a little more unusual, perhaps a geographical code name, or a classification level I wasn't immediately familiar with from my usual domain. EB, of course I recognized. Extraterrestrial biological entity, a term that had certainly gained currency in popular culture, but one I'd only ever encountered in the most speculative, and usually swiftly debunked, corners of the fringe. Seeing it on what appeared to be an official, albeit heavily redacted, document fragment in my own study, felt incongruous. Like finding a circus ticket pressed into the pages of a philosophical treatise. I almost refolded it, ready to dismiss it. Probably a training document, a hypothetical exercise, or more likely, a piece of deliberate disinformation from some obscure counterintelligence program designed to be leaked and to muddy the waters about something else entirely. The 70s and 80s were rife with that sort of thing. We used to call it feeding the squirrels, tossing out just enough nonsense to keep the conspiracy theorists busy and away from the real secrets. I placed the fragment on my desk, the soft glow of the lamp making the black redactions seem even darker, more absolute. My mind, trained by decades of archival discipline, began to automatically search for context, for provenance. But there was none. Just this orphaned piece of paper, speaking in broken, tantalizing phrases. Zeta designation, I murmured to myself, tapping a finger against the paper. Zeta Reticuli, of course, sprang to mind. That binary star system so beloved by certain enthusiasts. The alleged origin of the aliens in that rather famous abduction case from the 60s. The Hill case, wasn't it? A story I'd always mentally filed under compellingly strange, utterly unverifiable. To think this fragment, this stray piece of official-looking paper, could have any connection to that sort of narrative, well, it was, to put it mildly, a stretch. A fanciful leap my rational mind was quite unwilling to make. And yet, it sat there, on my desk, under my lamp, a tiny stubborn anomaly in the otherwise orderly landscape of my retirement. Project S. It was probably nothing. It was certainly nothing. I picked it up, intending to file it away in the Curiosities Unexplained folder I kept, half-jokingly, for such oddities. But I found myself hesitating. The weight of the paper, the crispness of the type, the very definitive nature of those black redactions, they spoke of a certain seriousness, a certain gravity, that was hard to ignore, even for a seasoned skeptic like myself. For now, I told myself, I would simply let it be, a small puzzle, a riddle for a quiet evening. No harm in that, no harm at all. It stayed on my desk for several days, that fragment, tucked just under the rim of my leather desk blotter, like a secret shared only between me and the polished oak. Each evening, as I settled down with a book or some light correspondence, my eyes would invariably drift to it. The stark black on creamy paper, a tiny island of the unknown in my meticulously ordered world. My initial resolve to dismiss it as bureaucratic chaff began to fray, not through any dramatic revelation, but through the slow, persistent erosion of curiosity. It was the archivist in me, you see, the part that cannot abide an uncatalogued item, an unanswered query, Zeta designation. The phrase echoed with a faint, almost literary resonance that was distracting. I told myself it was an intellectual exercise, a way to keep the old mental gears from seizing up in the quietude of retirement. My first attempts to contextualize it were, predictably, fruitless. I searched my own mental archives, decades of acronyms, project codenames, departmental jargon, Project S, dozens of possibilities, none fitting the peculiar, almost exotic flavor of Zeta designations or EB Type 1. Then, I turned to my computer. My son Michael had set me up with a rather powerful machine, far more capable than the clunky terminals I'd used for most of my career. I'd become reasonably proficient, though I still missed the tactile reassurance of card catalogs and bound indices. I started with the basics, broad searches on declassified project databases, Project S, and Cold War, Project S, and unconventional technology. Thousands of results, of course. A digital haystack. I scanned through lists of vaguely relevant projects, meteorological studies, psychological warfare initiatives, early stealth programs. Nothing that resonated with the fragment's specific terminology. Nothing that felt right. I tried variations. Project Sierra, Project Stardust, Project Sierra. Each search was a slow cast of a net into the vast ocean of digitized information. Each retrieval brought up nothing but common minnows. The term EBE was particularly troublesome. In official declassified parlance, it was virtually non-existent. It lived almost exclusively in the vibrant speculative ecosystem of ufology websites and amateur forums, places I, as a rule, avoided. Places where enthusiasm so often outstripped evidence. Yet, the fragment on my desk wasn't from one of those websites. It had the undeniable feel of government issue, the precise typeface, the specific weight of the paper, even the slightly acrid smell of old ink from the redactions. These were familiar sensations. I remember one evening, Eleanor had already gone up to bed. The house was utterly still, save for the hum of the refrigerator from the kitchen and the distant sigh of wind in the eaves. I found myself staring at the fragment again. Avoid, direct what? Exposure, contact. The missing words hung there, pregnant with unspoken possibilities. It was the redactions themselves that began to intrigue me most. They were so absolute, so thick. Not the casual line-through of a document deemed mildly sensitive, but the heavy, deliberate obliteration reserved for information deemed truly, profoundly secret. What could warrant such comprehensive censorship, even decades later? A ridiculous thought. I know, but it was these small, nagging details that kept me from simply shredding the fragment and forgetting about it. The archivist's instinct, perhaps. Or maybe just the quiet boredom of a man with too much time on his hands, drawn to a puzzle simply because it was there. Either way, the little piece of paper was beginning to exert a subtle pull, a gentle insistence that I look just a little deeper. The study in our house faces west. In the late afternoons, especially during the autumn months, the setting sun has a habit of sending long amber fingers of light across my desk. It was during one such moment, when a particularly sharp ray sliced through the dusty air, that I noticed something peculiar. I'd left the fragment lying flat, just beside my keyboard. The sunlight, almost parallel to the desk surface, caught the paper at an oblique angle. For a fleeting instant, no more than a heartbeat, the dense black of one of the redaction marks seemed to become almost translucent, and beneath it, or perhaps within it, I thought I glimpsed the ghost of a letter, a peep, perhaps, or an R. I blinked, and it was gone. The ink was as opaque, as absolute as ever. I shifted the paper, trying to recapture the angle, the precise quality of light. But the moment had passed. The sunbeam crept further across the room, and the illusion, if that's what it was, did not return. Chalk it up to old eyes, I told myself. A trick of the light, the kind of fleeting visual artifact that sometimes dances at the periphery of perception. Yet, the image of that ghostly letter lingered. It was unsettling, not because it was dramatic, but because it was so subtle, so easily dismissed. It made me question my own senses, a sensation I've always found profoundly uncomfortable. This small, uncertain observation, however, nudged me further. If my eyes were playing tricks, perhaps a different kind of lens would prove more reliable. The following evening, I retrieved my old philatelist's magnifying glass from a desk drawer, the one with the built-in light. I hadn't used it in years. Under the bright, focused beam, the paper's fibers were clearly visible, the typescript sharp and defined. The redactions, however, remained stubbornly opaque. They were printed with a heavy, slightly glossy ink that absorbed the light completely. There were no hidden layers that I could discern, no obvious signs of tampering beyond the redaction itself. The fleeting glimpse in the sunlight remained an isolated, inexplicable incident. Perhaps it had just been a trick of the eye. Still, the incident spurred me to refine my online searches. The phrase Zeta designations had lodged itself in my mind. It felt specific, too specific for a common codename. With a renewed sense of, not quite conviction but persistent curiosity, I typed it into the search bar, this time in quotation marks to narrow the field. Zeta designation and project. The results were different this time. Fewer, certainly, and the sources, they were not the familiar government archives or academic databases. These were other places. Websites with names that hinted at the esoteric, the clandestine, forums buzzing with acronyms I didn't recognize, and a dizzying array of theories, each more elaborate than the last. And there, amidst the digital chatter, a name began to surface repeatedly, linked directly to Zeta designations and variations of Project S. That name was Project Serpo. I leaned back in my chair, a frown etching itself onto my features. Serpo. It sounded like something out of a pulp science fiction magazine from the 1950s. I clicked on a link, then another, a sense of mild deflation beginning to settle in. The story, as it unfolded across these various websites and discussion threads, was elaborate, extraordinarily so. A supposed top-secret exchange program between the United States government and alien beings from a planet called Serpo, orbiting one of the stars in the Zeta Reticuli system. 12 military personnel, the story went, traveled to Serpo in 1965, lived there for over a decade, and then a handful returned. It was all allegedly revealed through a series of anonymous emails from supposed retired DIA officials in the early 2000s. My initial reaction was one of profound skepticism, bordering on dismissal. This was the very definition of the fringe material I'd spent a career sidestepping. A grand, convoluted narrative based on anonymous sources, circulated on the wilder shores of the internet. It had all the hallmarks of a well-constructed hoax, a kind of collaborative fiction perhaps, spun by enthusiasts. It was in a way almost a relief. If this Serpo was the answer, then the fragment on my desk was likely just a piece of that modern folklore. Perhaps someone had printed out elements of the Serpo story onto official-looking paper as part of a game or a more elaborate deception. It would explain EB and Zeta designation. It would make it mundane, manageable. And yet, I picked up the fragment again. The paper still felt resolutely real. The ink, the typeface, the very specific nature of the redactions, they didn't feel like the work of an amateur hoaxer. They felt official, earnest. Could this elaborate Project Serpo narrative, which I was only just beginning to uncover online, have somehow improbably intersected with a genuine classified government project? Or was the fragment in my hand truly just a discarded prop from a story far stranger than any I'd encountered in my decades of sorting through the government's documented secrets? The sun had long set. The only light in my study now came from the glow of the monitor, painting the room in cool digital hues. The house was silent, and in that silence, the enigma of the paper in my hand seemed to deepen, even as I uncovered what seemed like a plausible, if outlandish, explanation. The Serpo websites, with their fervent believers and equally fervent debunkers, became a hesitant, late-night preoccupation. I approached them as I would any unverified source, with extreme caution, cataloging claims, cross-referencing names and dates, always looking for the telltale signs of fabrication. Most of it, I had to admit, felt like wishful thinking layered upon rumor, amplified by the echo chambers of the internet. It was a fascinating study in modern folklore, certainly, but hardly credible. Then the emails began. It was a Monday morning, I recall. I was going through my usual routine. Coffee, the morning paper still stubbornly delivered in its physical form, a cursory check of my inbox for messages from Eleanor's sister or my old chess partner, and there it was. An email from an address I didn't recognize. A jumble of alphanumeric characters followed by a generic untraceable domain. The subject line was simply regarding your recent inquiries. My inquiries? I hadn't made any direct inquiries, not in any formal sense. My online searches had been anonymous, or so I believed. A chill, faint, but distinct, traced its way down my spine. I almost deleted it. Cybercriminals, phishing schemes, the usual digital detritus, but the subject line, it was too specific, too knowing. With a sense of unease, I opened it. The message was brief, almost curt. It was unencrypted, surprisingly, but written in a peculiar stilted prose, like a poorly translated official document. Your attention to archived anomalies is noted, it began. Matters pertaining to Project House and associated designations, including Serpo, are best approached with discretion. Not all doors are meant to be opened. Some lanterns are best left unlit. It was signed simply, Lantern Holder. I stared at the screen, my coffee growing cold beside me. Lantern Holder. It was both ominous and oddly poetic. Was this some kind of elaborate prank? Someone who had somehow tracked my relatively innocuous online browse? Possible, I supposed. The internet had its share of digital eavesdroppers and mischief makers. I didn't reply. What would I say? I archived the email in a new secure folder, a reflex action. A few days later, another arrived, same sender. This one was slightly longer, and even more perplexing. It contained a string of numbers and a single, cryptic phrase, "Consider the weight of the 12. Not all returned as they left. The 12, of course, featured prominently in the Serpo lore. The 12 military personnel who supposedly made the journey. But the weight, it was frustratingly vague. The string of numbers, I discovered after some effort, corresponded to an old, declassified military specification for a type of radiation shielding material. Interesting, perhaps, but hardly a smoking gun. It could mean anything. Or, more likely, nothing at all. Lantern Holder's emails continued to arrive sporadically, once or twice a week, never demanding anything, never threatening. They were a strange mix of oblique warnings, philosophical musings, and what seemed like fragments of information, sometimes a document number that, when I very cautiously searched for it, would lead to a heavily redacted report on atmospheric research from the 1970s, or a technical paper on long-duration spaceflight life support systems. Always plausible, always deniable, always just out of reach of concrete meaning in relation to Serpo. The Ebens mind perceives time, not as a river, but as a landscape, one email offered. To understand their journey, one must understand their map. Another time, it was a single sentence: the blue-green sun of Serpo leaves its mark, even on the soul. I found myself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. My rational mind, the archivist trained to demand concrete proof, dismissed these emails as sophisticated digital noise, perhaps from someone deeply embedded in the Serpo mythology, trying to lend it an air of active, clandestine reality. Yet, the fragment on my desk, it was the anchor, the tangible piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit the hoax theory so neatly. Lantern Holder never mentioned the fragment directly, never alluded to my possession of it, but their messages danced around the very terms, the very essence, of what that fragment hinted at. The what-if began to grow, a tiny seed of doubt that these anonymous messages, these late-night readings of internet lore, and the scrap of paper in my possession were somehow connected. What if there was a kernel of truth, however small, however deeply buried, beneath the mountain of speculation? What if Lantern Holder wasn't a prankster, but someone genuinely, if cautiously, trying to guide or warn me? The weight of that what if was surprisingly heavy. It settled in my thoughts during my quiet walks, during my solitary evenings in the study. It was the subtle dissonance between my lifelong skepticism and the unsettling confluence of these disparate elements. The mystery was no longer just an intellectual exercise. It was beginning to feel personal, a quiet challenge to the very foundations of my ordered world. The peace of my retirement felt different, still peaceful on the surface, but underneath, a new current was stirring. The anonymous emails from Lantern Holder had unsettled his carefully constructed skepticism, creating a space where the improbable could perhaps breathe. The tangible fragment on his desk remained the silent epicenter of this growing unease. The clues from Lantern Holder, if that's what they were, often involved strings of alphanumeric characters, document references, case numbers, archival tags. Most, as I said, led to heavily redacted reports or seemingly unrelated technical papers. I began to compile a list of these references, a habit ingrained from decades of archival work. Patterns, I've always believed, can emerge from even the most chaotic data if one looks long enough, and with the right lens. It was late one evening, the kind of profound stillness that only settles in after midnight, when I was idly staring at this list. A sequence of numbers from a reference provided by Lantern Holder, allegedly pertaining to interstellar atmospheric ionization studies, seemed to jump out at me. 17, teen, prime numbers, unmistakably. A coincidence, I told myself. Prime numbers occur naturally, but then I started examining other codes, other numerical sequences Lantern Holder had subtly woven into their cryptic messages, or that I had noted from the metadata of the documents they'd pointed towards. And there it was again. And again, not always consecutive, not always obvious, but prime seemed to be a recurring motif, like a hidden signature. Out of sheer intellectual curiosity, a way to pass the long hours, I began to play with these numbers. What if they weren't random? What if they signified something else? I tried plotting them as coordinates, converting them to different base systems, even, in a flight of fancy, correlating them with star catalog numbers. Most of this yielded nothing but gibberish, mathematical dead ends. But one sequence, derived from a particularly dense cluster of document accession numbers related to long-term bioisolation effects, seemed to resolve into a set of ratios that, when I tentatively applied them to known astronomical distances within our local stellar neighborhood, pointed, vaguely, in the direction of the Zeta Reticuli system. It was a wild leap, of course, pure numerology, perhaps. The kind of pattern-seeking the human mind excels at, especially when faced with ambiguity. I could almost hear my old statistics professor scoffing. And yet the correlation, however, tenuous, however reliant on a series of interpretive choices, sent a shiver through me. Zeta Reticuli, the alleged home of the Ebens, the destination of Project Serpo. It felt less like a discovery and more like an echo, a resonance from the very documents that were supposed to obscure, not reveal. It was around this time, perhaps emboldened by this whisper of a pattern, that I took a deeper dive into a particular set of declassified archives. Lantern Holder had hinted at records from a now-defunct Air Force Medical Research Unit that had, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, apparently studied the long-term physiological and psychological effects of extreme environmental isolation on military personnel. Much of it was dry, statistical, but buried deep within a subfolder, mislabeled and poorly scanned, was a document that caught my breath. It was titled simply, Debriefing Transcript, Subject R7, Eyes Only. The R, I presumed, stood for returnee. Most of the pages were almost entirely blacked out, vast continents of redaction. But here and there, like tiny resilient islands, phrases and sometimes whole sentences had survived the censor's pen. Set, the twin suns. Set, one fragment read. Set, the relentless pale light of the smaller and the fierce amber of the larger. Impossible to truly describe the sky. There. My heart hammered against my ribs. The twin suns were a cornerstone of the Serpo lore. Further down, another island of text. See, the silence of the great desert on Serpo. A silence that wasn't empty, but full of a different kind of listening. The Ebens called it Sia, soul quiet, Tiante. A word I'd seen on one of the more esoteric Serpo forums, dismissed as fan-invented jargon. And then, perhaps the most haunting fragment of all. See, the Ebon understanding of time, not a progression, but a presence. They could revisit moments, not physically, but experientially. It changed how one perceived loss and memory. I read these fragments again and again, the dim light of my monitor illuminating the stark black and white of the scanned page. This wasn't the detached, technical language of the other reports. This was human, poetic almost, filled with a sense of profound, lived experience. This returnee #7, whoever they were, was describing things that resonated deeply with the most vivid and consistent elements of the Project Serpo narrative. A wave of empathy, unexpected and powerful, washed over me, for this anonymous individual, subjected to who knows what experiences, then debriefed, censored, and likely sworn to a lifetime of silence. The sterile term subject R7 suddenly felt like a profound injustice. This was a voice, a human voice, speaking from behind a wall of official secrecy. The weight of what if grew almost unbearable in that moment. If this transcript was genuine, if these words were the authentic reflections of someone who had been there, then the implications were staggering. The outlandish tales on the internet, the cryptic clues from Lantern Holder, the anomalous fragment on my desk, and now these ghostly poetic utterances from returnee #7, they were all beginning to converge, to sing in a strange, unsettling harmony. My carefully constructed skepticism was no longer a fortress. It felt more like a sieve, with the impossible steadily, quietly, trickling through. The words of returnee 7 had left an indelible mark, transforming his intellectual curiosity into something far more personal, far more resonant. The abstract theories were now tinged with the ghost of a human voice, speaking of experiences beyond ordinary comprehension. The gentle ticking clock, the soft hum of the computer, and the quiet ambiance of Arthur Sipp's study continue. Arthur Sipp's voice is calm, but now carries a deeper undercurrent of emotional engagement and intellectual obsession. The phrases from that redacted transcript, the twin suns, the silence of the great desert, TNT, they echoed in my mind for days. They had a raw authenticity, that the often sensationalized accounts on the internet lacked. It felt true in a way that disturbed me profoundly. If returnee #7 was real, then the 12 were real. My archival instincts, honed over a lifetime, began to itch in a new way. The ciphers, the astronomical alignments, the fragment on my desk, lantern holders' cryptic guidance, and now these haunting words, they were all compelling, in their own way. But the archivist in me craved something more, structural, something that hinted at the logistics, the personnel, the sheer mundane reality of such an audacious undertaking, if it had indeed occurred. How does one hide 12 individuals for over a decade, especially 12 individuals likely drawn from the highly regimented world of the U.S. military? Their absence would leave ripples, however faint, in the vast ocean of official records. And so I began a new line of inquiry, perhaps the most ambitious, and certainly the most tedious, yet I started to look for the crew. The time frame, according to the Serpo lore, was roughly 1965 for departure and 1978 for the return of the survivors. I focused my attention on those years and the periods immediately surrounding them. My access to comprehensive classified military personnel records was of course long gone with my retirement. But vast swaths of older records, particularly from those eras, had been declassified, digitized, and were accessible through various public archives and specialized databases, if one knew where and how to look. It was like searching for specific grains of sand on an endless beach. I looked for teams of 12, or thereabouts, teams with a plausible mix of skills mentioned in the Serpo accounts: pilots, linguists, scientists, medics, security personnel. I looked for anomalous patterns in service records, sudden transfers to unspecified or highly classified assignments around 1964 or 1965, extended periods of detached duty or special assignment where the details were vague or missing. And then, crucially, I looked for corresponding patterns of reappearance, or perhaps medical retirement, or even recorded deaths under unusual or sparsely detailed circumstances around 1978 or 1979. Days bled into nights. My study became a hermitage. Eleanor worried. I knew, though she mostly kept her concerns to herself, merely ensuring a steady supply of tea, and the occasional gentle reminder that the sun was in fact still rising each morning. Much of my research led to predictable dead ends. Records were incomplete, lost to time, or simply too vast to correlate effectively with my limited resources. But then, slowly, painstakingly, a few faint signals began to emerge from the noise. One group, in particular, caught my attention. 11 men and 1 woman, all Air Force personnel, with a remarkable confluence of specializations: 2 experimental test pilots, a biologist with a background in extreme environments, a geologist, 2 linguists fluent in several obscure tonal languages, a medical doctor specializing in aerospace medicine, a psychologist, and 4 highly decorated security specialists. Their records showed them all being transferred to a newly formed, vaguely titled Special Projects Groups at Edwards Air Force Base in late 1964. And then, silence. For 13 years, their service records showed only periodic, pro forma updates: assigned Special Projects Group, no specific duties listed, no commendations, no further transfers, just assigned. It was like they had stepped into a void. Then, in early 1979, the pattern shifted. 2 of them were listed as deceased, non-combat incident, details classified. 3 were medically retired with severe, though vaguely described, psychological and physiological conditions. 4 others, including the woman, were honorably discharged with commendations for meritorious service on a highly sensitive long-duration assignment, and then they too seemed to vanish from public life. The remaining 3, their records simply ended. No discharge, no retirement, no death certificate that I could find in any accessible database. They became ghosts in the machine. Circumstantial, of course. Entirely circumstantial. There could be a dozen other explanations for such a pattern. A different, equally secret terrestrial project. A deep cover intelligence operation. Data corruption in the archives. I knew all the rational counter-arguments. But the number 12, the time frame, the skills, and the sheer prolonged opacity of their records. It resonated with the Serpo narrative, with an unsettling precision. I printed out the few publicly available, heavily grainy photographs I could find of these individuals from their earlier service years. Young, serious faces, staring out from a bygone era. I pinned them to the corkboard above my desk, next to the fragment of the redacted document. They were no longer just names in a database or figures in a wild internet story. They were potentially them, the 12, or at least a disturbingly plausible candidate list for that ghost crew. The weight of knowing, or rather, the weight of suspecting with such intensity, was different now. It was no longer just about alien planets or suppressed technologies. It was about these faces, these lives. If even a fraction of the Serpo story was true, what had these people seen? What had they endured? What had become of those whose records simply evaporated? The what if was no longer a playful intellectual exercise. It had acquired a human face. Or rather, 12 of them, and they stared back at me from the past, silently demanding an answer I did not have. The faces of that potential ghost crew now looked out from his corkboard, silent witnesses to his solitary, late-night vigils. The weight of their possible story, intertwined with the enigma of Serpo, had settled deeply within him. My study, once a bastion of orderly retirement and predictable scholarship, had transformed. It was still quiet, still my sanctuary, but it now pulsed with a different kind of energy. It had become the repository of whispers, a nexus where the improbable and the tangible uneasily coexisted. The first pale hints of dawn were beginning to touch the edges of the drawn curtains. Another night had passed, lost in the labyrinth of my research. On my desk, the original fragment lay protected under a sheet of clear mylar, its redacted lines more eloquent than any full page of text I had ever read. Beside it, a stack of printouts, lantern holders' cryptic emails, their gnomic phrases underlined and annotated, my calculations regarding the prime numbers and their tentative astronomical alignments were neatly clipped together, and of course the notes on returnee #7, those haunting snatches of a voice from an unimaginable elsewhere. The faces of the 12, or rather the 11 men and 1 woman whose records bore those strange prolonged silences, looked down from the corkboard. I found myself speaking to them sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night. Not aloud, of course, but in my thoughts, asking silent questions, wondering about the color of Serpo's sky, the nature of the Ebens, the crushing weight of the secrets they might have carried. I was no longer the staunch, dismissive skeptic who had first unfolded that stray piece of paper. That Arthur had been eroded, layer by slow layer, by the steady drip of anomalies, by the persistent, unsettling resonance between these disparate threads. I hadn't found proof in the way a court of law, or indeed the archivist I once was, would demand. There was no signed confession, no unambiguous photograph of an alien craft, no piece of irrefutable alien technology. What I had was a confluence, a tapestry woven from suggestive shadows, the official feeling fragment that started it all, the fleeting, almost hallucinatory shift in the redaction ink, the persistent, strangely knowledgeable voice of lantern holder, always guiding, never coercing, the eerie mathematical whispers that seemed to map a path to Zeta Reticuli, the profoundly human, achingly real testimony of returnee #7. And now, these very real military personnel, with their skills, their numbers, and their 13 years of official, unexplained silence. Each thread, taken in isolation, could perhaps be explained away. Coincidence, misinterpretation, hoax, overactive imagination. But together they formed a pattern, a narrative so compelling, so internally consistent in its strangeness, that to dismiss it entirely felt like an act of intellectual denial, a stubborn refusal to see the shape of the elephant whose trunk I held in the dark. The what-if had blossomed from a tiny seed of curiosity into a vast, shadowy tree whose branches touched the stars. What if this incredible story, or something very much like it, was true? What if humanity had indeed taken that tentative, audacious step into the cosmic neighborhood, and then, for reasons I could only guess at, drawn a thick veil of secrecy over the entire endeavor? The implications were immense, of course, for history, for science, for our very understanding of our place in the universe, and the thought that this knowledge, this monumental chapter of the human story, might be deliberately suppressed, locked away in vaults deeper and darker than any I had ever navigated, filled me with a profound sense of, not anger, but a deep, abiding melancholy, a sorrow for the lost opportunity, the stifled revelation. The first bird began to sing outside my window, a hesitant, tentative note in the pre-dawn stillness. The world outside was preparing to wake up to its ordinary routines, its accepted truths. And here I sat, in my small study, surrounded by the ghosts of an extraordinary, unacknowledged voyage. I knew, with a certainty that had settled deep in my bones, that I would never be able to prove Project Serpo, not in any conventional sense. The powers that guard such secrets, if they exist, are far too adept at their craft. But I also knew that I could no longer not believe in the possibility of it. The evidence, circumstantial as it was, had tipped the scales within my own mind. The weight of this knowing was a curious thing. It wasn't frightening. It wasn't even particularly exhilarating. It was sobering. A quiet understanding that the world was infinitely stranger, infinitely more complex than I had ever allowed myself to imagine. And in that strangeness, there was a kind of profound beauty, a humbling sense of scale. He sits in his study, a sanctuary filled with the echoes of an incredible, unverified story, the weight of his research settling around him like the morning mist. The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice and more like a natural culmination. All these threads, all these whispers, all these carefully gathered fragments of a story too vast to hold in one's mind comfortably, they needed to be brought together. Not for publication. I knew that with certainty. Who would believe it? And what tangible proof could I offer beyond my own meticulous, yet ultimately circumstantial, tapestry? No, this would be for myself, and perhaps, in some abstract sense, for posterity. A single coherent record of one retired archivist's accidental stumble into the looking glass. I opened a new document on my computer. The blank white page glowed softly in the dim light of the encroaching dawn. I recounted it all, from the discovery of the fragment to the faces on my corkboard. I detailed lantern holders' cryptic pronouncements, the unsettling mathematics of the prime numbers, the haunting phrases from returnee #7's debriefing. I described my methodology, my initial skepticism, and the slow, inexorable shift in my own perception. It was not a polemic, nor an attempt to convince. It was a chronicle, a testament to the possibility. As I listed the names of the 12 individuals from that special projects groups, my ghost crew, I paused. One surname, a common one, Smithson, snagged my attention. I had a distant cousin on my mother's side, twice removed, a career military man I'd met only a handful of times at family gatherings decades ago. His name had been Smithson. John, I thought. Or was it James? He would have been the right age in 1965. A fleeting, absurd thought. A common name. Nothing more. Yet for a moment, The vast impersonal mystery touched the edge of my own remote family history, sending a tiny, almost imperceptible shiver through me. I typed the name and moved on. The act of writing was cathartic, as if the burden of these extraordinary thoughts, these unverified certainties, was being gently transferred from my mind to the digital page. Each sentence crafted, each piece of evidence laid out in sequence, brought a measure of peace. When I finally typed the last word, the sun was fully risen. Its light, filtered through the curtains, painted stripes across my desk, across the faces on the corkboard, across the fragment itself. My report, my unsent letter to posterity, was complete. I saved it, encrypted it with a password drawn from one of returnee #7's poignant phrases, and then simply sat back in my old leather chair. I didn't feel triumphant, nor did I feel the agitation of a secret too large to keep. Instead, a profound sense of quiet pervaded me. The world outside my window was going about its business, unaware of Serpo, of the Ebens, of the 12, of the universe of secrets that lay just beneath the surface of its ordinary days. And that was, perhaps, as it should be. The mystery remained, of course, unresolved. The fragment on my desk was still just a fragment. Lantern holder was still just an anonymous email address. The faces on the corkboard were still just old photographs of service members whose lives had taken an unexplained turn. But something had shifted within me, irrevocably. The universe, I now understood, was not just larger than I had imagined. It was more deeply layered, more intricately woven with hidden narratives and silent monumental events than my 40 years in the archives had ever led me to believe. I looked at the assembled evidence, at my completed chronicle. The lingering question was no longer if such things could be, but rather, what else? What other wonders, what other profound encounters lay sleeping in the forgotten files and redacted histories of the world? A gentle weariness settled over me, the kind that comes after long, meaningful work. I closed my eyes. The images of twin suns, desert landscapes, and distant stars swirling lazily in my mind's eye. The truth, I thought, was perhaps not a destination to be arrived at, but a horizon that expands the further one journeys towards it. And in that expanding horizon, there was not fear, but a quiet, unending sense of awe.